Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Captain Robert Pichet for a second. You're flying a massive 200-ton aircraft over the pitch-black Atlantic Ocean, responsible for 306 souls, and suddenly, your plane transforms into a completely powerless glider. No engines, no runway in sight, and literally zero precedent in aviation history for what you're supposed to do next. Today, we're unpacking the unbelievable story of Air Transat Flight 236.
Now look at this number, 19 minutes. That is the agonizing, unprecedented amount of time Captain Pichet had to fly this giant commercial jet without a single drop of engine power. It actually still holds the record for the longest powerless glide of a passenger jet ever. But to really grasp the terrifying weight of those silent minutes, we need to look at the exact moment the nightmare became undeniably real.
236 Heavy declaring fuel emergency. Pichet made that chilling radio call at 5:48 a.m., but let's skip ahead just a bit to 6:26 a.m. He's cruising at 34,000 feet. 13 minutes after his right engine just starves of fuel and dies, the left engine shuts down too. Pichet literally watches his cockpit screens go pitch dark. The entire cabin behind him plunges into blackness. 306 people are relying entirely on him, and they are roughly 144 kilometers away from the nearest piece of solid land.
So, how did we get here? Part 1. A chain of errors. The tick-ticking time bomb. The crazy thing is, this wasn't just a sudden stroke of terrible luck. To understand what Pichet was up against, we actually have to rewind 9 days. A trap was unknowingly being set. The airline didn't have a spare engine on hand, so they borrowed an older Rolls-Royce replacement. The mechanics were completely rushed, fighting against a tight Sunday departure deadline, and they couldn't access the offline service manual. So, they took a shortcut. They combined incompatible hydraulic and fuel tubes on the right engine. From the outside, they looked pretty similar, but inside it was an absolute disaster waiting to happen. Over the course of several flights, the normal vibration and pressure caused these mismatched tubes to just rub together. By the time Pichet was cruising over the Atlantic, that friction had actually worn straight through the metal, creating this L-shaped crack. The plane started silently bleeding fuel at a massive rate, 13 metric tons per hour, while Pichet flew on, completely in the dark about it. And why didn't he know? Because, believe it or not, the Airbus A330 didn't actually have a direct automated warning system for fuel leaks back then. And then comes the human error that turned a really bad situation into Pichet's absolute worst nightmare. When the cockpit finally got a warning that there was a fuel imbalance between the left and right wings, the crew made a fatal assumption. Instead of pulling out the checklist for a suspected fuel leak, they just relied on memory. They went with a standard fuel imbalance procedure and opened a crossfeed valve. What that actually did, it took all the good fuel from the left wing and pumped it directly into the right wing, right out of the leak and straight into the ocean. They accidentally doubled their own problem. For Pichet, this was just a relentless ticking clock. The flight data recorder shows fuel dropping rapidly at 4:38 a.m. But it's not until 5:33 a.m. that the imbalance warning actually flashes. By 5:48, they realize they're definitely not making it to Lisbon. They declare an emergency and divert toward the Azores. At 6:13, the right engine just dies from fuel starvation. And finally, at 6:26 a.m., the left engine stops. That 200-ton aircraft, it's now just a silent glider. Which brings us to part 2, the impossible glide, bush pilot instincts. We're back in that silent cockpit with the man holding 306 lives in his hands. Now, Captain Pichet had a staggering 16,800 hours of flying experience, but honestly, it wasn't just the sheer number of hours. It was the kind of flying he'd done. He was a former bush pilot. He'd spent years flying in some seriously treacherous conditions, constantly landing planes on remote lakes or in dense jungles without any runways. He basically knew how to handle an aircraft by pure instinct and feel. So, faced with dead engines, Pichet doesn't panic. He instantly executes this critical decision matrix. First up, he needs basic power. Second, he has to prepare the crew for the terrifying reality of a nighttime water ditching in the open ocean. And third, he has to channel those deep-rooted bush pilot instincts to stretch the plane's glide 144 kilometers to the Lajes military base in the Azores. He's got exactly one shot at this landing. No engine power means no second chances, no go-arounds.
To even have a ghost of a chance at making that glide, the plane automatically deployed something called the RAT, the Ram Air Turbine. It's basically this small external wind turbine that drops down to generate emergency electrical power. But here is the wild part, and Pichet's incredible burden. To keep this little turbine spinning and generating just enough juice to light up his basic cockpit screens, he had to maintain a minimum speed of 140 knots. So he's flying this massive, heavy, unpowered metal tube through the pitch dark, constantly balancing his speed against his altitude with absolute life-or-death precision.
Meanwhile, behind Pichet's locked cockpit door, things were utterly terrifying. That comforting constant hum of the jet engines, just gone. It was so perfectly silent in the cabin that people said their ears were ringing. Flight attendants are scrambling, trying to help people with life jackets, fighting through language barriers with passengers who didn't speak English or French. Pichet knew he was prepping them for a highly fatal nighttime water ditching. It's an incredibly dangerous maneuver, especially when you can't even see the ocean swells in the dark. And even if they somehow survived the impact, the freezing Atlantic waters posed an immediate deadly risk of hypothermia. Now, despite the grim statistics showing only a 76% survival rate for water ditchings, and that's under relatively good conditions, the human will to survive is just incredible. There's this unforgettable anecdote from a passenger named Bezikas. Fully aware of the horrible odds of a nighttime ocean crash, he absolutely refused to accept death. He turned to his wife, told her to prepare to swim to shore, and firmly said, "We will need our shoes." That kind of raw defiance in the cabin, it perfectly mirrored Pichet's own fierce determination up at the controls. Nobody on that plane was giving up.
Moving into part 3, the miracle landing and the flawed hero. Pichet's incredible, calculated glide actually paid off. At 6:45 a.m., breaking through the early morning darkness, this entirely powerless plane violently slams onto the runway at the lodge's military base. He applies extreme braking, which completely locks the main wheels. Tires are blowing out, sparks are literally flying everywhere as the massive plane skids down the tarmac. But, against all conceivable odds, it stops.
In under 2 minutes, all 306 people are evacuated. Think about that result for a second. An impossible 19-minute glide and 0 casualties. None. There were only 2 serious injuries and 16 minor ones, and those were mostly just from the emergency evacuation slides. But for the airline, the fallout was absolutely massive. The Canadian Transport Minister handed down a record-breaking $200,000 fine against Air Transat, and passengers filed a $30 million class action lawsuit for the severe, lifelong trauma they went through during that silent descent.
Now, in the days right after this, Pichet was rightfully so, hailed as an absolute hero. But then a pretty shocking twist about his past leaked to the press, adding this totally complex layer to the story. About 20 years before pulling off this miraculous landing, Captain Pichet had actually been arrested in the United States for smuggling drugs. He served time in a Georgia prison and had only been fully pardoned the year before Flight 236.
So naturally, this sparked a ton of questions about how a convicted smuggler even became a commercial pilot in the first place. But you know what? For the passengers on Flight 236, absolutely none of that mattered. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to reflect on. Was it those exact rough, unconventional experiences, the risky bush flying, living life a bit outside the standard lines, that equipped Pichet with the precise, ice-cold instincts required to save 306 lives? It really makes you wonder how a lifetime of diverse, maybe even flawed experiences can prepare a person to be the exact savior needed when the engines go completely silent. Think about that for a bit, and we'll catch you on the next explainer.